Have you ever felt something was off, but no one would believe you? Have you ever stayed quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because you were waiting for the truth to reveal itself? Sometimes, the most painful battles are not fought outside, but inside your own home, your own trust, your own silence. And in those moments you don't just question others, you begin to question your own reality. This is not just a story about betrayal, it's not just about family, or conflict, or what was taken and what was hidden. This is a story about awareness. About the moment you stop reacting and start observing, about the shift from emotional chaos to quiet control, and about how truth, even when buried, always finds its way to the surface. Because when trust is tested and silence becomes your only shield, something powerful begins to change inside you. You stop looking for answers in words, and start looking for answers in patterns, actions, and proof. What you are about to hear is a journey from confusion to clarity, from emotional pressure to inner strength, and from being controlled by doubt to standing firmly in truth. But be warned, once you start seeing the truth clearly, you can never unsee it again. So stay with this story till the end, because every moment builds toward a realization that changes everything. Hard-earned success and personal sacrifice are often invisible to others, but they form the foundation of everything a person builds in life. Every achievement carries a story that most people never see. The long nights filled with exhaustion, the silent battles with doubt, and the constant pressure to keep going even when quitting feels easier. Success is rarely a moment. It is a process shaped by discipline, resilience, and choices that demand giving up comfort in exchange for growth. While others may only notice the outcome, they overlook the years of effort, the risks taken, and the sacrifices made along the way. There is a unique kind of pain in realizing that something earned through relentless dedication is not valued by those closest to you. Personal sacrifice often means missing out on celebrations, delaying gratification, and prioritizing long-term goals over immediate happiness. It involves saying no when others say yes, staying focused when distractions are everywhere, and carrying responsibilities without expecting recognition. Over time, these sacrifices shape not only external success but also inner strength and independence. What makes this journey even more complex is the expectation that family will naturally understand and respect that effort. When they fail to see the weight of those sacrifices, it creates a deep emotional conflict. The very people who witnessed parts of the struggle may still underestimate its significance, treating the result as something easily shared or even taken. This disconnect can feel like a betrayal, not just of ownership but of the entire journey that led to it. Hard-earned success is deeply personal because it represents more than material achievement. It reflects identity, growth, and proof of capability. Every decision, every moment of persistence, contributes to something that cannot simply be handed over or dismissed. The value lies not just in what is built, but in who a person becomes while building it. Family entitlement versus personal boundaries is a conflict that often grows quietly over time, rooted in expectations that are rarely spoken out loud but strongly felt. In many families, there is an unspoken belief that what one person earns somehow belongs to everyone, especially when emotional ties are used to justify access and control. This sense of entitlement can appear subtle at first, disguised as concern, advice, or suggestions framed as what's best for the family. Over time, however, it begins to cross lines, turning into assumptions that personal achievements should be shared, redistributed, or even surrendered without question. Personal boundaries, on the other hand, are the invisible lines that define what is acceptable and what is not. They are not about rejection or selfishness, but about self-respect and clarity. Setting boundaries means recognizing that individual effort, time, and sacrifice deserve acknowledgement and protection. It is an assertion that love and connection do not grant ownership over someone else's life or decisions. However, when entitlement is deeply ingrained, boundaries are often met with resistance, confusion, or even guilt-driven reactions designed to make someone feel wrong for standing their ground. Between these two forces becomes especially intense when personal success enters the picture. What one person sees as the result of years of hard work, others may view as a resource to be shared or claimed. This creates a clash of perspectives, one rooted in individual ownership, the other in collective expectation. The situation becomes more complicated when emotional pressure is applied, making it difficult to distinguish between genuine care and manipulative intent. Phrases that appeal to loyalty or obligation can blur the lines, making it harder to assert boundaries without feeling like one is betraying the family. Navigating this dynamic requires a strong sense of self and the courage to prioritize long-term well-being over short-term approval. It involves understanding that boundaries are not barriers to love, but protections against being diminished or controlled. Without them, entitlement can continue to expand, slowly eroding independence and self-worth. Emotional betrayal by parents carries a weight that is difficult to put into words because it strikes at the very core of trust and identity. From an early age, parents are seen as protectors, guides, and the people who provide unconditional support. That belief becomes deeply rooted, shaping how a person understands love, safety, and belonging. When that trust is broken, it doesn't just create disappointment, it creates a sense of disorientation, as if the foundation of reality has shifted without warning. This kind of betrayal is often not loud or obvious at first. It can come through actions that contradict words, decisions made without consideration, or behavior that prioritizes control or favoritism over fairness and understanding. What makes it particularly painful is the emotional closeness involved. Unlike betrayal from outsiders, this feels personal in a way that cuts deeper, because it comes from those who are expected to stand by you no matter what. The realization that their support has limits or conditions can feel like a loss of something that was once unquestioned. There is also an internal struggle that follows. Part of the mind tries to justify or minimize what happened, holding on to the idea that parents always mean well. Another part begins to recognize patterns, inconsistencies, and intentions that can no longer be ignored. This conflict creates confusion, guilt, and even self-doubt. Questions arise about whether one is overreacting or misunderstanding the situation, especially when the betrayal is subtle or denied outright. That uncertainty can be just as damaging as the betrayal itself. Emotional betrayal by parents also challenges the idea of identity. Since much of a person's early sense of self is shaped by parental influence, being hurt by them can lead to a deeper questioning of self-worth and value. It forces a shift from seeking validation within the family to finding it internally. This transition is not easy, but it is often necessary to regain a sense of stability and control. Over time, recognizing the betrayal becomes a turning point, rather than just a painful experience. It creates awareness, strengthens emotional independence, and redefines what trust and respect truly mean in relationships. The illusion of unconditional love is one of the most powerful beliefs people carry, especially within a family. From a young age, there is an understanding, often unspoken, that parental love is limitless, steady, and immune to change. It is seen as something that exists regardless of circumstances, mistakes, or differences. This belief creates a sense of emotional security, allowing a person to trust freely and feel accepted without needing to prove their worth. It becomes a foundation for how love is understood in all other relationships. However, as life unfolds, that illusion can begin to crack. Love that once seemed unconditional may start to show patterns, expectations, or even conditions that were never clearly acknowledged before. It may become tied to obedience, agreement, or the fulfillment of certain roles within the family. When those expectations are not met, the response can shift, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. This shift reveals that what was once perceived as unconditional may have always carried underlying limits. The realization of this can be deeply unsettling. It forces a person to reevaluate past experiences and recognize moments where love may have been influenced by control, approval, or personal benefit. Actions that once seemed caring may take on a different meaning when viewed through a clearer lens. This doesn't necessarily erase the presence of love, but it changes how that love is understood. It introduces complexity where there was once certainty. There is also an emotional conflict that arises from this awareness. Part of the mind wants to hold on to the original belief because it offers comfort and familiarity. Letting go of the idea of unconditional love can feel like losing something fundamental, almost like grieving a version of reality that no longer exists. At the same time, accepting the truth creates a sense of clarity, even if it comes with discomfort. This shift in understanding often leads to a deeper form of emotional independence. Instead of relying on the expectation of unconditional support, a person begins to define their own sense of worth and stability. Love is no longer seen as something that is automatically guaranteed, but as something that must be understood in its true form, with all its limitations and boundaries. Trust broken inside the home carries a uniquely deep impact, because the home is meant to be the one place where defenses are lowered and vulnerability feels safe. It is where honesty is expected, where intentions are assumed to be genuine, and where relationships are believed to be rooted in care rather than hidden motives. When that trust is broken within such a space, it does more than create conflict. It alters the very meaning of safety and belonging. This kind of breach often begins quietly. It may not come in the form of a dramatic event, but through small inconsistencies, unexplained decisions, or behaviors that don't align with what is being said. At first, these signs are easy to dismiss. There is a natural tendency to give the benefit of the doubt, especially when it involves family. Doubt feels uncomfortable, so it is often replaced with rationalization. Over time, however, those small moments begin to form a pattern that becomes harder to ignore. What makes this situation particularly complex is the emotional attachment tied to the environment. The home is not just a physical place, it is filled with memories, shared experiences, and a sense of identity. When trust is broken there, it can feel like those memories are being rewritten, as if something once pure has been compromised. The emotional weight of that realization can lead to confusion, hurt, and even a sense of disbelief. There is also an internal struggle that develops. On one hand, there is a desire to confront the issue and seek clarity. On the other, there is hesitation driven by fear of conflict or the possibility of confirming something painful. This hesitation can lead to silence, observation, and a growing sense of emotional distance. The person affected may begin to withdraw, not out of indifference, but as a way to protect themselves from further harm. As the truth becomes clearer, the impact of the broken trust deepens. It is no longer about isolated actions, but about a shift in perception. The sense of security that once existed is replaced with awareness, and that awareness changes how everything is experienced within that space. Quiet manipulation behind closed doors often operates in ways that are difficult to detect at first, because it avoids open conflict and instead relies on subtle influence. It doesn't announce itself through loud arguments or obvious control. Instead, it moves through tone, suggestion, and carefully chosen words that seem harmless on the surface. This kind of manipulation thrives in private spaces, where conversations are hidden from outside perspectives and where trust is assumed rather than questioned. It usually begins with small, seemingly insignificant moments, ideas planted gently, opinions framed as concern, or repeated suggestions that slowly shape perception. Over time, these patterns build, creating a narrative that feels natural even though it has been carefully guided. Because it is not forceful, it often goes unnoticed, allowing the manipulator to maintain an image of innocence or good intention. This makes it especially difficult to challenge, as there is rarely a single moment that clearly defines what is happening. One of the most powerful aspects of this dynamic is how it can influence emotions without direct confrontation. Doubt, guilt, and obligation can be subtly introduced, making a person question their own instincts. The manipulation becomes internalized, leading to hesitation and second-guessing. What once felt clear begins to feel uncertain, and decisions that should be straightforward become complicated by an underlying sense of pressure. The closed-door nature of this behavior adds another layer of complexity. Without witnesses, it becomes one person's experience against another's denial. If confronted, the manipulator can easily dismiss concerns, reframe the situation, or shift blame, further deepening confusion. This creates an imbalance where the truth feels difficult to prove, even when it is strongly felt. Over time, the accumulation of these subtle influences can have a significant impact. It can alter relationships, shift power dynamics, and create an environment where control exists without ever being openly acknowledged. Recognizing this pattern requires awareness and a willingness to trust one's own perception, even when it conflicts with what is being presented on the surface. The importance of ownership and independence goes far beyond material possessions, reaching into the core of identity and self-worth. Ownership represents the result of effort, discipline, and persistence, while independence reflects the ability to stand firmly on one's own decisions without relying on external validation. Together, they create a sense of control over one's life, shaping not only what a person has, but who they become in the process of achieving it. Ownership carries a deeper meaning because it is often tied to personal sacrifice. Every decision made, every opportunity taken or declined, contributes to something that is uniquely earned. It is not simply about having something in one's name, but about the journey that led to it. This connection makes ownership personal and non-transferable in an emotional sense, even if others may view it as something that can be shared or redistributed. When someone tries to diminish or claim that ownership, it can feel like an attempt to erase the effort and determination behind it. Independence complements this by providing the strength to protect what has been built. It involves the ability to make decisions without being swayed by pressure, expectations, or emotional manipulation. Independence requires confidence, not just in one's choices, but in one's right to make those choices. It creates a boundary between external influence and internal conviction, allowing a person to remain grounded even when faced with opposition. The relationship between ownership and independence becomes especially significant when external forces begin to challenge personal boundaries. Without independence, ownership can become vulnerable to control or entitlement from others. Without ownership, independence may lack a tangible foundation, making it harder to maintain a sense of stability. Together, they reinforce each other, creating a balance that supports both personal freedom and responsibility. This dynamic also shapes how a person views themselves in relation to others. It shifts the mindset from seeking approval to asserting self-respect, from dependency to self-reliance. It encourages clarity in understanding what belongs to oneself, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally as well. Subtle favoritism within families often goes unnoticed at first, because it rarely presents itself in obvious or openly acknowledged ways. Instead of clear declarations, it appears through patterns. Small differences in tone, attention, opportunities, and expectations that gradually reveal an imbalance. It may look like one person's needs being prioritized more frequently, their mistakes being forgiven more easily, or their desires being treated as more important. Because these actions are spread out over time and often justified as situational, they can be difficult to identify in isolation. What makes subtle favoritism particularly impactful is how it shapes perception and self-worth without direct confrontation. The person experiencing it may not immediately label it as unfair, but they begin to feel the effects internally. There is a quiet awareness that something is off, even if it cannot be clearly explained. This can lead to self-questioning, where they wonder if they are overreacting or being too sensitive. Meanwhile, the consistent pattern continues, reinforcing a sense of being less valued or overlooked. Favoritism also influences the dynamics within the family as a whole. It can create unspoken hierarchies, where one person is given more authority or trust, while another is expected to compromise or adjust. Over time, this imbalance becomes normalized, making it harder to challenge. Those who benefit from it may not even recognize its presence, while those affected by it may struggle to articulate their experience without facing dismissal or denial. The emotional impact of this dynamic can be deep and long-lasting. It can lead to feelings of resentment, not just toward the situation but toward the individuals involved. At the same time, there may be guilt for feeling that way, especially when the family environment outwardly appears functional. This combination of emotions creates internal conflict, making it difficult to process what is happening in a clear and confident way. As awareness grows, subtle favoritism becomes harder to ignore. It reveals patterns that were once dismissed, and highlights the underlying imbalance that has been shaping interactions over time. Gaslighting and denial of truth are powerful psychological dynamics that can distort a person's perception of reality, especially when they come from those who are trusted. Gaslighting involves manipulating someone into questioning their own thoughts, memories, or understanding of events. It often begins subtly, with small contradictions or dismissals that seem insignificant on their own. Over time, these moments accumulate, creating confusion and self-doubt that weaken a person's confidence in their own judgment. Denial plays a crucial role in reinforcing this effect. When facts are presented or concerns are raised, they are dismissed, minimized, or completely rejected. This creates a situation where reality feels unstable, as if what is clearly seen or experienced is somehow being rewritten. the person affected may begin to wonder if they misunderstood something or if their reaction is exaggerated. This internal questioning becomes the foundation of control, as it shifts trust away from one's own perception and toward the narrative being imposed. One of the most challenging aspects of this dynamic is its emotional impact. It does not rely on force or open confrontation, but instead works through subtle influence and repetition. The person experiencing it may feel increasingly uncertain, anxious, or even isolated, as their version of events is consistently invalidated. This can lead to a gradual loss of confidence, making it harder to speak up or assert boundaries. What once felt clear becomes clouded, and decisions become more difficult to make. Gaslighting is particularly effective when it is combined with emotional closeness. When it comes from someone within the family, the natural instinct is to trust rather than question. This makes it easier for denial to take hold, as the idea that a trusted person could intentionally distort reality feels difficult to accept. As a result, the affected individual may spend more time trying to reconcile the situation than challenging it. Over time, recognizing these patterns becomes essential for regaining clarity. Awareness allows a person to separate their own perception from the manipulated narrative, restoring a sense of control and confidence in what they know to be true. The turning point moment is often not loud or dramatic in the way people expect, but it carries a quiet intensity that changes everything. It is the point where confusion begins to fade and clarity takes its place, where scattered doubts suddenly connect into a pattern that can no longer be ignored. Before this moment, there may have been hesitation, second-guessing, and a willingness to give the benefit of the doubt. After it, there is a shift in perception that makes it impossible to return to the way things were. This moment is usually built over time rather than happening instantly. Small observations, uncomfortable feelings, and inconsistencies accumulate beneath the surface. Each one may seem insignificant on its own, but together they create a growing sense that something is not right. The turning point occurs when all of these pieces align, revealing a clear picture that cannot be dismissed or explained away. It is the realization that what once felt uncertain is now undeniable. Emotionally, this shift can be complex. There may be shock in finally seeing the truth, especially if it challenges long-held beliefs or trust. At the same time, there is often a sense of relief, as the internal conflict between intuition and doubt begins to resolve. What once felt confusing becomes clear, even if that clarity is uncomfortable. It marks the end of questioning oneself and the beginning of understanding the situation as it truly is. This moment also changes how decisions are made moving forward. Instead of reacting emotionally or seeking validation, there is a stronger focus on awareness and control. The need to prove or explain may diminish, replaced by a quiet confidence in what is known. Actions become more deliberate, guided by clarity rather than uncertainty. The turning point is significant because it represents a shift in power. It moves control away from external influence and places it firmly within the individual. What happens next is shaped not by confusion or manipulation, but by a clear understanding of reality and the strength to respond accordingly. Installing security cameras in this context goes beyond a simple act of monitoring a physical space. It represents a shift in mindset from passive trust to active awareness. It is not driven by fear alone, but by a growing need for clarity when instincts begin to signal that something is not right. This decision often comes after a period of internal conflict where doubt and intuition compete for attention. Choosing to install cameras becomes a way to resolve that conflict without confrontation, allowing truth to emerge on its own. The act itself is quiet and deliberate. There is no announcement, no attempt to create tension or suspicion. Instead, it reflects a calculated approach, observing rather than reacting, understanding rather than assuming. It shows restraint because instead of addressing concerns emotionally or prematurely, there is a willingness to wait for undeniable evidence. This patience becomes a form of strength, allowing the situation to reveal itself without interference. Symbolically, the cameras represent control being reclaimed. When trust is uncertain, relying solely on words or appearances can leave too much room for manipulation or denial. By introducing an objective form of observation, the balance begins to shift. What is captured is not influenced by emotion, memory, or interpretation. It exists as a record of reality. This removes ambiguity and replaces it with something concrete that cannot easily be dismissed. There is also an emotional layer to this decision. Installing cameras means acknowledging that trust has been compromised, even if it has not yet been fully proven. That realization can be difficult to accept, especially when it involves people who were once trusted without question. At the same time, it reflects a commitment to self-protection and truth, even when that truth may be uncomfortable. As time passes, the presence of those cameras becomes more than just a precaution. It becomes a silent witness, capturing moments that might otherwise remain hidden or denied. It transforms uncertainty into evidence, providing clarity in a situation where words alone may not be enough to reveal what is really happening. Discovery of hidden intentions is a moment that carries both clarity and discomfort, because it reveals not only what was happening, but also what was deliberately kept out of sight. It is the point where assumptions are replaced by undeniable awareness, where actions and motives align in a way that leaves little room for doubt. Before this discovery, there is often a mixture of trust, suspicion, and uncertainty. After it, there is a shift toward understanding that cannot easily be reversed. Hidden intentions rarely appear suddenly. They are usually built over time through subtle behavior, indirect communication, and carefully concealed decisions. The discovery happens when these elements come together in a way that exposes the underlying motive. It might be a conversation, a pattern of actions, or a piece of evidence that reveals more than what was initially visible. What makes this moment powerful is not just what is seen but what it confirms, feelings and instincts that may have been questioned or dismissed before. Emotionally, this realization can be overwhelming. There is often a sense of shock in recognizing that something significant was happening without awareness. At the same time, there can be a quiet validation of intuition, as doubts that once felt uncertain are now grounded in reality. This combination of surprise and confirmation creates a complex response, where clarity brings both relief and discomfort. The discovery also changes how past interactions are viewed. Moments that once seemed harmless may take on new meaning when seen through the lens of this awareness. Conversations, decisions, and behaviors are reinterpreted, revealing patterns that were not fully understood before. This reevaluation can deepen the emotional impact, as it highlights the extent to which intentions were concealed. As awareness settles in, it becomes difficult to ignore or minimize what has been uncovered. The discovery does not just reveal a single truth, it reshapes the entire understanding of the situation, influencing how trust, communication, and relationships are perceived moving forward. Shock and disbelief often arrive together as an immediate response when reality suddenly contradicts deeply held expectations. It is a moment where the mind struggles to process what has just been revealed, because it does not align with what was previously believed to be true. The initial reaction is not always loud or expressive. Sometimes it is quiet, almost frozen, as if time has slowed down to allow the weight of the realization to settle in. Thoughts become scattered, trying to make sense of something that feels both clear and impossible at the same time. Disbelief acts as a temporary shield, protecting the mind from fully absorbing the impact all at once. There is a natural tendency to question what has been seen or heard, searching for alternative explanations that might make the situation less painful or more acceptable. It is a form of resistance, not because the truth is unclear, but because accepting it would require a sudden and significant shift in understanding. This internal resistance can create a sense of detachment, where emotions are held back while the mind attempts to catch up with reality. As the moment continues, shock begins to give way to a deeper awareness. The initial confusion starts to organize itself into recognition, and the facts become harder to deny. This transition is often uncomfortable, as it forces the mind to move from uncertainty into acceptance. The realization may bring a mix of emotions, hurt, anger, disappointment, but they tend to follow after the initial phase of disbelief has begun to fade. What makes this experience particularly intense is the contrast between expectation and reality. When something unexpected is revealed, especially in a context where trust was assumed, the difference between what was believed and what is true can feel overwhelming. It creates a gap that must be mentally and emotionally reconciled, and that process takes time. As understanding deepens, the shock transforms into clarity. The mind begins to accept what has been uncovered, even if it remains difficult to fully process emotionally. The disbelief fades, replaced by a more grounded awareness of the situation as it truly is. Staying calm instead of reacting emotionally requires a level of control that does not come naturally in moments of tension or betrayal. When something unexpected or hurtful is revealed, the immediate instinct is often to respond with emotion, anger, frustration, or confrontation. These reactions feel justified because they match the intensity of the situation. However, choosing calmness in such moments is not about suppressing emotion, but about managing it in a way that preserves clarity and control. Calmness creates space between what is felt and how one chooses to respond. Instead of allowing emotions to dictate actions, it allows time for observation and understanding. This pause becomes powerful because it prevents impulsive decisions that might complicate the situation further. Emotional reactions, while natural, can sometimes reveal intentions, weaken positions, or shift focus away from the actual issue. Remaining calm keeps the attention on what matters, rather than on the reaction itself. There is also a strategic element to this approach. When others expect a strong emotional response, calmness can disrupt that expectation. It removes the opportunity for the situation to escalate or be redirected through emotional manipulation. Without visible reaction, it becomes harder for others to control the narrative or dismiss concerns as overreactions. Calmness, in this sense, becomes a form of quiet strength that maintains balance even when circumstances are unstable. Internally, this choice is not always easy. Emotions do not disappear simply because they are not expressed outwardly. They remain present, often intense, requiring discipline to contain and process them privately. This internal effort reflects a deeper level of self-awareness, where understanding the situation takes priority over immediate release. It is a conscious decision to value long-term clarity over short-term expression. Over time, staying calm in difficult moments builds resilience. It strengthens the ability to navigate complex situations without losing control or direction. It also reinforces a sense of self-trust, where decisions are made thoughtfully rather than reactively, creating a more stable and grounded response to challenges. Gathering evidence instead of arguing reflects a shift from emotional reaction to strategic thinking, especially in situations where truth may be questioned or denied. When faced with conflict, the natural instinct is often to defend oneself through words, to explain, justify, or confront directly. However, arguments can quickly become circular, driven by emotion rather than clarity, where facts are blurred and perspectives clash without resolution. Choosing to gather evidence changes the entire dynamic, moving the focus from opinion to proof. This approach requires patience and discipline. Instead of reacting in the moment, there is a conscious decision to observe, document, and understand what is actually happening. It involves paying attention to details, noticing patterns, and allowing situations to unfold without interference. This process can feel slow, especially when emotions are strong, but it creates a foundation that is far more solid than any immediate reaction. Evidence builds quietly, piece by piece, until it forms a clear and undeniable picture. There is also a sense of control that comes with this method. Arguments often depend on persuasion, where one side tries to convince the other, sometimes without success. Evidence, on the other hand, speaks for itself. It reduces the need for prolonged explanation and limits the ability for others to distort or dismiss the truth. When proof is present, the conversation shifts from what happened to how to respond to what is clearly shown, making it harder to avoid accountability. Emotionally, this choice can be challenging. Holding back from arguing may feel like allowing the situation to continue unchecked, and there may be moments of frustration or urgency. However, this restraint is part of the strength behind the approach. It prioritizes long-term resolution over short-term satisfaction, recognizing that a well-supported truth carries more impact than a heated exchange. As evidence accumulates, confidence grows. The uncertainty that once existed begins to fade, replaced by clarity and assurance. This preparation transforms the situation from one of doubt and conflict into one of understanding and control, where the truth is not just felt, but clearly demonstrated. The power of truth over manipulation lies in its ability to remain steady and undeniable, even when faced with distortion, denial, or control. Manipulation often depends on confusion, emotion, and selective narratives to influence perception. It works by shaping how situations are interpreted, sometimes bending reality just enough to create doubt or shift responsibility. In contrast, truth does not rely on persuasion or tactics. It exists independently of how it is presented, and its strength comes from its consistency. Manipulation can be convincing in the short term because it appeals to emotions and exploits trust. It may create temporary uncertainty, causing someone to question their own understanding or feel pressured to accept a version of events that does not fully align with reality. However, this influence is often fragile. It requires continuous effort to maintain, as inconsistencies and contradictions eventually begin to surface. Over time, the more manipulation is used, the more difficult it becomes to sustain without revealing its flaws. Truth, on the other hand, does not need constant reinforcement. Once it is clearly seen and understood, it remains stable. It provides clarity where there was once confusion, and it allows decisions to be made with confidence rather than hesitation. When supported by evidence or direct observation, truth becomes even more powerful, as it limits the ability for others to deny or reinterpret what is clearly present. It shifts the balance of control, reducing reliance on opinion and increasing reliance on fact. There is also an internal strength that comes from aligning with truth. It reinforces self-trust, allowing a person to rely on their own perception rather than being influenced by external narratives. This clarity creates a sense of stability, even in situations where manipulation is present. Instead of being pulled into cycles of doubt or argument, there is a grounded understanding that does not easily waver. As truth becomes more visible, the influence of manipulation begins to weaken. What once seemed convincing may start to appear inconsistent or forced. This shift does not always happen instantly, but it becomes more evident over time as clarity replaces confusion. Confrontation backed by proof carries a fundamentally different energy than confrontation driven by emotion alone. When emotions lead, conversations can become reactive, filled with interruptions, denials, and attempts to shift blame. The focus often drifts away from the core issue and into defending feelings or perspectives. However, when proof is present, the dynamic changes. The conversation becomes grounded in something tangible, something that does not rely on interpretation or persuasion. This kind of confrontation is not about raising voices or asserting dominance. It is about presenting reality in a way that cannot easily be dismissed. Proof introduces a level of certainty that removes ambiguity, making it difficult for others to deny what is clearly shown. Instead of engaging in a back-and-forth argument, the focus shifts to acknowledging what exists. This creates a moment where excuses become weaker, and attempts to redirect the conversation lose their effectiveness. There is also a sense of preparation behind this approach. Gathering evidence beforehand allows the confrontation to be intentional rather than impulsive. It shows that time was taken to understand the situation fully, rather than reacting to isolated moments. This preparation adds weight to the interaction, demonstrating that the issue is not based on assumption or misunderstanding, but on something concrete and verifiable. Emotionally, this method can provide a sense of stability. Knowing that proof exists reduces the fear of being dismissed or invalidated. It allows a person to remain more composed, as they are not relying solely on their own words to be believed. This can make it easier to maintain control during the conversation, even if the other side reacts defensively or attempts to avoid accountability. At the same time, confrontation with proof does not guarantee acceptance. There may still be resistance, denial, or attempts to minimize what is presented. However, the presence of evidence limits how far those reactions can go. It anchors the conversation in reality, making it harder for the truth to be completely ignored or distorted. Silence as strength is often misunderstood because silence is commonly associated with weakness, avoidance, or lack of response. In reality, silence can be one of the most powerful forms of control in emotionally charged or manipulative situations. It is not the absence of action, but a deliberate choice to withhold reaction, words, or emotional engagement, when doing so would only create further confusion or escalation. This kind of silence is intentional and grounded in awareness, not fear. When faced with conflict or provocation, the expectation is usually a reaction. People anticipate defense, explanation, or emotional release. Breaking that expectation through silence changes the dynamic completely. It removes the immediate fuel that often drives arguments or manipulative exchanges. Without reaction, there is no emotional leverage to exploit, and the situation loses some of its intensity. Silence creates space where emotions cannot easily dictate the direction of the moment. Silence also allows observation. Instead of becoming consumed by the need to respond, attention shifts to understanding what is truly happening. This creates clarity that is often lost in heated exchanges. When words are withheld, there is more room to process information, recognize patterns, and evaluate intentions without interference. This makes silence not passive, but highly analytical in nature. Another important aspect of silence as strength is emotional protection. Not every situation deserves explanation or engagement, especially when responses may be twisted, dismissed, or used against the person speaking. Choosing silence prevents unnecessary exposure of thoughts and emotions that could be misunderstood or manipulated. It preserves internal stability while reducing external vulnerability. Over time, silence can also shift power dynamics. When one side refuses to engage in predictable emotional cycles, it disrupts control mechanisms that rely on reaction. It introduces uncertainty for the other party, as silence does not provide feedback or confirmation. This absence of response can often speak louder than words, signaling boundaries without direct confrontation. Silence becomes a form of discipline, requiring restraint and awareness. It is not about suppressing truth, but about choosing when and how to express it. In this way, silence transforms into a quiet but powerful assertion of control, clarity, and self-respect. Reclaiming personal power is the process of taking back control over one's emotions, decisions, and boundaries after a period of influence, confusion, or imbalance. It often begins after realizing that external forces, whether people, circumstances, or emotional pressure, have been shaping choices more than personal will. This realization is not always sudden. It can emerge gradually through repeated experiences where intuition, fairness, or self-respect feels compromised. Once awareness sets in, the focus begins to shift from reaction to restoration. At its core, personal power is about self-direction. It is the ability to decide without being overly influenced by fear, guilt, or expectation. When this power is weakened, decisions may feel forced or uncertain, often made to maintain peace or avoid conflict rather than reflect true intent. Reclaiming it involves recognizing these patterns and slowly stepping away from them. It is not about rejecting others entirely, but about ensuring that their influence does not override personal truth. This process also involves rebuilding confidence in one's own perception. When trust has been questioned or distorted, it becomes easy to doubt instincts. Reclaiming power requires reconnecting with those instincts and acknowledging that internal awareness has value. It means learning to trust what feels consistent and true, even when external voices attempt to challenge it. This restoration of self-trust becomes a foundation for stronger decisions moving forward. Boundaries play a crucial role in this stage. Reclaiming power is not only internal but also expressed externally through clear limits. These boundaries define what is acceptable and what is not, protecting emotional and mental stability. They help prevent repeated patterns of overreach or control, ensuring that past dynamics do not continue unchecked. Setting boundaries is not an act of aggression, but of clarity and self-respect. Over time, reclaiming personal power leads to a shift in identity. The focus moves away from being influenced or shaped by others, and toward becoming grounded in one's own choices and values. This transformation creates a sense of independence that is steady and self-sustaining, allowing decisions to be made with confidence, rather than hesitation or pressure. Setting firm boundaries is a defining step in protecting emotional, mental, and even practical stability after experiencing imbalance or overreach from others. It is the moment where awareness turns into action, and internal understanding is translated into clear external limits. Boundaries are not created to push people away, but to define the space in which respectful and healthy interaction can exist. Without them, relationships can become blurred, where personal needs are overlooked or consistently overridden. Firm boundaries begin with clarity. A person must first understand what feels acceptable and what does not, based on their own values, experiences, and well-being. This clarity often comes after moments of discomfort, where repeated patterns reveal what cannot continue. Once that understanding is established, it becomes necessary to communicate or enforce those limits in a consistent way. The strength of boundaries lies not only in recognizing them, but in maintaining them even when challenged. One of the most difficult aspects of setting boundaries is the emotional resistance that often follows. Others may react with surprise, frustration, or attempts to negotiate the limits being set. This reaction can create pressure to revert back to previous patterns for the sake of comfort or harmony. However, firm boundaries require consistency even in the face of discomfort. They are not dependent on approval, but on self-respect and long-term well-being. Boundaries also serve as a filter for behavior. They make it clear what is acceptable and what is not, reducing confusion and preventing repeated misunderstandings. When consistently upheld, they reshape interactions, encouraging more respectful and balanced dynamics. Over time, people begin to understand the new limits, and the relationship adjusts accordingly, either strengthening through mutual respect or weakening if control was previously the foundation. Emotionally, setting firm boundaries can bring both relief and challenge. Relief comes from no longer tolerating what causes harm or discomfort, while challenge arises from breaking old patterns of accommodation. This transition requires patience and inner strength, as change is rarely immediate or universally accepted. Ultimately, firm boundaries are an expression of self-worth. They communicate that a person's time, energy, and emotional space are valuable and not open to unrestricted access or influence. Walking away from toxic dynamics is often one of the most difficult yet transformative decisions a person can make, because it involves separating not just from people or situations, but from long-standing emotional attachments and expectations. Toxic dynamics are not always obvious at first. They can exist within families, relationships, or environments where moments of care are mixed with patterns of control, manipulation, or emotional harm. This combination creates confusion, making it harder to recognize when staying is no longer healthy. The decision to walk away usually develops gradually. It begins with discomfort, repeated patterns of disrespect, or a growing awareness that personal well-being is being compromised. Over time, these experiences build clarity, even if emotional resistance remains. There is often an internal conflict between loyalty and self-preservation, where the desire to maintain connection clashes with the need for peace and stability. This conflict can delay action, as emotional bonds and history make separation feel overwhelming or even guilt-inducing. Walking away does not always mean immediate physical distance. It can also begin as emotional detachment. This involves stepping back from reactive engagement, reducing involvement in harmful patterns, and slowly prioritizing internal balance over external approval. It is a process of reclaiming energy that has been consumed by cycles of stress, confusion, or emotional imbalance. As this shift begins, clarity often increases, making the toxicity more visible than it was before. One of the most challenging aspects of this decision is dealing with the reactions of others. Toxic environments often resist change, especially when control or influence is being reduced. There may be attempts to guilt, persuade, or reframe the situation to discourage separation. This is where inner strength becomes essential, as the decision must remain rooted in personal well-being rather than external pressure. As distance grows, whether emotional or physical, a new sense of awareness begins to form. The absence of constant tension allows space for reflection, healing, and rebuilding. Patterns that once felt normal begin to appear unhealthy in hindsight, reinforcing the importance of the decision. Ultimately, walking away from toxic dynamics is not an act of rejection, but an act of self-preservation. It is a conscious choice to prioritize mental clarity, emotional health, and long-term peace over situations that continuously diminish well-being. Redefining what family means is a deeply personal and often painful transformation that happens when traditional expectations no longer align with lived experience. For many people, family is initially understood as unconditional love, loyalty, and protection. It is assumed to be a constant source of safety and support, regardless of circumstances. This definition is usually shaped early in life, and rarely questioned until experiences challenge its accuracy. When trust is broken or emotional boundaries are crossed, that original definition begins to shift. The realization emerges that family is not always defined by blood or obligation, but by behavior, respect, and emotional safety. This shift does not happen instantly, it develops through repeated experiences where expectations of care are not met or are replaced with control, misunderstanding, or emotional harm. Over time, these experiences force a reevaluation of what connection truly means. Redefining family often involves separating emotional ideals from reality. It becomes necessary to distinguish between the idea of what family should be and what it actually is in practice. This process can be unsettling because it challenges long-held beliefs and cultural conditioning. Letting go of the traditional definition may feel like a loss, even when it leads to clarity and self-protection. There is often grief involved, not for the people themselves, but for the expectations that no longer hold true. As this understanding evolves, boundaries become more important. Redefining family does not necessarily mean cutting ties completely, but it does mean changing the terms of engagement. Respect, honesty, and emotional safety become non-negotiable standards. Relationships that cannot meet these standards may need to be distanced or restructured in a way that protects personal well-being. This shift also encourages the recognition that chosen relationships can hold equal or greater value than biological ones. Trust, support, and genuine care become the true markers of connection, rather than obligation or shared history alone. In this way, family becomes less about origin and more about consistency of behavior and emotional alignment. Ultimately, redefining what family means is about reclaiming the right to determine what feels safe, respectful, and supportive. It is a process of aligning relationships with truth rather than assumption, allowing space for healthier and more authentic connections to exist. Self-respect over approval is the moment a person begins to value their own judgment, dignity, and emotional well-being more than the acceptance or validation of others. Approval is external, it depends on how others perceive actions, choices, or behavior. Self-respect, however, is internal, it is rooted in a clear understanding of personal worth and boundaries. When a person is driven primarily by approval, decisions are often shaped by fear of rejection, desire for acceptance, or pressure to maintain harmony, even at the cost of personal comfort or truth. Choosing self-respect means recognizing that constant approval is neither sustainable nor always genuine. It requires accepting that not everyone will agree with or support personal decisions, especially when those decisions involve setting boundaries or changing established dynamics. This realization can be uncomfortable at first, because it challenges the natural desire to belong and be accepted. However, it also opens the door to a more stable sense of identity that is not dependent on external validation. When self-respect becomes the priority, decision-making changes significantly. There is less tendency to over-explain, justify, or compromise personal values to avoid conflict. Instead, choices are guided by what feels right internally, even if they are not universally accepted. This does not mean ignoring others completely, but it does mean refusing to sacrifice personal well-being for the sake of temporary approval or peace. One of the most important aspects of self-respect is consistency. It is not a one-time decision but a continuous practice of honoring personal boundaries, values, and emotional needs. This often involves discomfort, especially when others are used to a pattern of compliance or agreement. Resistance from others is common, but maintaining self-respect requires staying grounded despite external pressure. Over time, prioritizing self-respect leads to stronger emotional stability. The need for constant validation decreases, and confidence in personal choices increases. Relationships also begin to reflect this shift, becoming more balanced and respectful, or naturally distancing when they cannot align with this standard. Ultimately, choosing self-respect over approval is about reclaiming inner authority. It is the decision to live in alignment with personal truth rather than external expectations, creating a more authentic and stable sense of self. Justice without revengeful chaos refers to the idea of seeking fairness, truth, and resolution, without allowing anger or emotional intensity to turn the situation into uncontrolled conflict. It is the difference between responding with clarity versus reacting with impulse. When someone is wronged, the natural emotional response may include anger, frustration, or a desire for immediate retaliation. However, revengeful chaos often leads to further damage, clouded judgment, and outcomes that do not truly resolve the underlying issue. Justice, in a calmer and more structured sense, is about restoring balance rather than creating additional harm. It focuses on ensuring that truth is acknowledged and boundaries are respected, without escalating the situation into destruction or emotional chaos. This approach requires discipline, because it means resisting the urge to act purely from emotional pain. Instead, it encourages thoughtful action that prioritizes long-term resolution over short-term emotional release. One of the key aspects of this idea is control over response. When emotions are high, decisions can become reactive, leading to actions that may feel satisfying in the moment but later create regret or complications. Choosing justice without chaos means stepping back long enough to assess the situation clearly, understand the facts, and respond in a way that is proportionate and grounded. It is about ensuring that actions align with truth rather than temporary emotion. This approach also strengthens personal integrity. Acting with restraint in difficult situations reflects inner stability and confidence. It shows that one does not need to lose control in order to address wrongdoing. Instead, strength is demonstrated through composure and clarity. This often leads to more credible outcomes, as responses rooted in calm reasoning are harder to dismiss or undermine. There is also an internal benefit to this mindset. Avoiding revengeful chaos prevents emotional exhaustion and regret. It allows space for healing rather than prolonged conflict. While anger may feel powerful in the moment, it often prolongs suffering, whereas measured justice creates closure and direction. Ultimately, justice without revengeful chaos is about choosing effectiveness over impulse, clarity over confusion, and resolution over destruction. It is a way of handling wrongdoing that preserves dignity while still addressing the truth of the situation. Emotional healing and clarity represent a stage that comes after intense experiences of betrayal, confusion, or conflict, where the mind and heart begin to settle into understanding rather than reaction. Healing is not immediate or linear. It unfolds gradually as the intensity of emotional pain begins to reduce and space is created for reflection. In the beginning, emotions may feel overwhelming, with thoughts repeatedly circling around what happened and why it happened. Over time, as distance from the situation increases, the emotional charge slowly weakens, allowing clarity to emerge. Clarity is the ability to see a situation for what it truly is, without the distortion of anger, fear, or attachment. It often arrives quietly, after the storm of emotions has passed. What once felt confusing or chaotic begins to make sense in a more structured way. Patterns become visible, intentions are better understood, and personal boundaries that were previously unclear start to take shape. This shift does not erase what happened, but it changes how it is interpreted and integrated into personal experience. Emotional healing also involves acceptance, not in the sense of approval but in recognizing reality without resistance. This acceptance reduces internal conflict, which is often the source of prolonged suffering. When the mind stops fighting against what cannot be changed, energy is redirected toward rebuilding inner stability. This is where growth begins to take root, even if the circumstances that cause the pain remain unchanged. Another important aspect of this process is self-reconnection. During periods of emotional distress, attention is often focused outward, on events, people, or unresolved questions. Healing shifts that focus inward, encouraging a person to reconnect with their own needs, values, and sense of identity. This reconnection restores balance and helps rebuild confidence that may have been weakened. As healing progresses, clarity continues to deepen. Decisions become easier, boundaries become clearer, and emotional reactions become more balanced. The situation that once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable in memory, even if it remains significant in meaning. This transformation reflects not forgetting but understanding in a way that no longer causes constant distress. Ultimately, emotional healing and clarity are about regaining inner stability, where past experiences no longer control present emotions, allowing a person to move forward with greater awareness and strength. Growth through betrayal is a complex transformation that often emerges from deeply painful experiences, where trust has been broken and expectations have been overturned. Although betrayal is emotionally damaging, it can become a turning point that forces a person to reevaluate their understanding of relationships, trust, and personal boundaries. This type of growth does not come from comfort or stability, but from disruption that challenges previously held beliefs about people and loyalty. In the beginning, betrayal usually brings confusion and emotional distress. There is a struggle to reconcile what was believed with what has actually occurred. This internal conflict can lead to questioning one's judgment, perception, and even self-worth. However, as time passes, reflection begins to replace confusion. The mind starts to analyze patterns, behaviors, and situations more objectively, separating emotion from reality. This shift is where growth begins to take shape. One of the most significant outcomes of growth through betrayal is increased awareness. A person becomes more observant of subtle behaviors, inconsistencies, and intentions that may have previously gone unnoticed. This heightened awareness helps in identifying red flags earlier and understanding the difference between genuine connection and conditional behavior. It strengthens discernment, making future decisions more informed and cautious. Another important aspect is emotional resilience. Experiencing betrayal forces a person to confront discomfort and pain, which gradually builds inner strength. Over time, the intensity of emotional reactions decreases, and the ability to remain composed in difficult situations improves. This does not mean becoming detached, but rather developing a healthier balance between emotion and judgment. Betrayal also often leads to a redefinition of trust. Instead of offering trust freely without evaluation, it becomes something that is earned through consistent actions over time. This shift does not create cynicism, but rather a more grounded and realistic approach to relationships. It encourages setting clearer boundaries and valuing actions over words. Ultimately, growth through betrayal is about transformation. It turns a painful experience into a source of insight, strength, and self-awareness, allowing a person to move forward with greater clarity and emotional maturity. Turning pain into strength is the final stage of emotional transformation, where experiences that once caused deep hurt begin to serve as the foundation for resilience, awareness, and personal empowerment. Pain in itself is not meaningful unless it is processed, understood, and integrated into one's sense of self. When left unresolved, it can remain a source of emotional weight, but when reflected upon, it becomes a powerful teacher that reshapes perspective and behavior. This transformation begins when a person stops resisting what has happened and instead starts examining it. Instead of focusing solely on what was lost or how they were hurt, attention shifts toward understanding what the experience revealed. This includes recognizing patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, and acknowledging lessons that were not visible in the moment of pain. This shift in focus marks the beginning of emotional conversion, where suffering starts to gain structure and meaning. As this process continues, the emotional intensity of pain gradually decreases. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel more distant, not because it is forgotten, but because it has been processed. In its place, a sense of clarity develops. This clarity allows a person to see themselves and their circumstances more objectively, without being fully controlled by emotional memory. It becomes possible to reflect without being pulled back into the same emotional state. Turning pain into strength also involves rebuilding identity. Experiences of hurt can often shake confidence and trust, both in others and in oneself. Through reflection and growth, these areas begin to heal, leading to a stronger sense of self-awareness and stability. The person learns not only what they can endure, but also what they will no longer accept. This creates a more defined internal framework for future decisions. Over time, pain becomes a reference point for strength rather than weakness. It serves as evidence of survival, adaptation, and emotional endurance. Instead of being something to avoid or suppress, it becomes part of personal history that contributes to wisdom and maturity. Ultimately, this transformation reflects the ability to rise beyond suffering, using it not as a limitation, but as a source of inner power and lasting growth. In conclusion, this entire journey reflects how truth slowly rises above confusion, how awareness replaces blindness, and how inner strength is built through experiences that are often painful but deeply revealing. What begins as doubt, silence, and emotional struggle gradually transforms into clarity, understanding, and self-respect. Each moment, from recognizing hidden intentions to gathering evidence, from staying calm to setting boundaries, represents a step toward reclaiming personal power and emotional independence. This story is not just about conflict but about growth. It shows that real strength is not found in reaction, but in patience, awareness, and the ability to stand firm in truth without losing control. It highlights how boundaries protect peace, how silence can carry power, and how self-respect ultimately matters more than approval or validation from others. Most importantly, it reminds us that even painful experiences can become turning points that lead to wisdom, maturity, and emotional healing. No matter how difficult the situation may seem at first, clarity always arrives for those who choose to observe, reflect, and remain grounded. And when it does, it changes everything, not by creating chaos, but by bringing understanding. Good luck to everyone listening who is going through their own silent battles. May you find the strength to stay calm in difficult moments, the courage to trust your intuition, and the wisdom to choose peace over conflict. May you always protect your boundaries, value your self-respect, and never lose sight of your truth, even when everything around you feels uncertain. Thank you for listening, and may your journey ahead be filled with clarity, strength, and peace.